I received a message that changed everything. Dude, your wife is doing this for money. I saw her yesterday on Pine Street, near the old motel. Are you kidding me? Check it out for yourself. At first I thought it was a stupid joke. My friend Rick has always been a fan of dramatic antics. But something in his tone, something in the message, stopped me. Marie couldn't have done this? Or could she? The feeling that the world was coming apart at the seams began to press on me with every passing second. I entered the address in a search engine. The location was a motel on the outskirts of the city. In the photo, the place looked miserable. Peeling paint, rusty signs, a typical place for meetings that are not spoken of aloud. My hands shook as I entered the number I found on the website. The call was short. The voice on the other end, female and professionally indifferent, answered immediately. Hello. How can I help you? I want to meet your best girl, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She asked about the time and place. I gave her the address of the rented apartment I had booked an hour before and heard her happily agree. She even gave me a name, Marie. Everything was spinning in my head. I took the car keys, drove to the place and sat in the apartment waiting. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to jump out of my chest. The door opened at exactly the right time. She walked in, my wife. In a short dress, wearing makeup, she looked like I hadn't seen her in a long time. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment she froze. And then shock, panic, hysteria. What are you doing here? She screamed. Her voice was trembling. Me? I'm here as a client. And you? Why are you here? I answered coldly. She began to rush around, making things up as she went along. It's not what you think. It's a mistake. You said yourself you were working late. I laughed. It was a bitter laugh. Almost crazy. A mistake? Then why is this number leading directly to you? Why are you here? And most importantly, why am I holding divorce papers? I put them on the table in front of her. Her face turned white. She tried for a long time to convince me that it was not what it looks like. But I wasn't listening anymore. All the times I worked late trying to give her a better life were running through my head. All the times she said she was going to her friends or to the gym. That was the end. I got up, walked to the door, and stopped to take one last look at her. Don't call again. And when they ask you why everything fell apart, tell them the truth. Tell them you chose money over me. I left, leaving her alone in this empty apartment. Outside the door I was greeted by a fresh wind and a feeling of freedom. It was painful, but I knew it was the right choice. This is how my new life began. No lies, no illusions. With only one lesson. Never ignore your instinct, even if the truth hurts more than betrayal. After I left that apartment, I had a feeling of emptiness. Marie had betrayed me, and now our whole life together seemed like a big lie. But that was not the end of the story. The next day I got a call from Rick. So, did you find out everything? He asked, without a hint of sarcasm in his voice. His tone was serious, almost pitiful. Yes, you were right, I answered briefly. Then listen further. There is more. You need to know that she did not act alone. There is someone who controls all this. I've heard of a man who organizes these services. And your wife is just a small cog in his scheme. These words knocked me out of my tracks. I thought I'd survive the worst. But now I realized that Marie's betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. And what am I supposed to do with this? I asked, barely containing my anger. Look into it if you want. But be careful. This man is not an easy target, Rick said and hung up. I knew that I would not be able to live in peace until I knew the whole truth. Questions were running through my head. Who was he? How did Marie get involved in this? And was she really a victim, or did she consciously choose this path? My investigation began with Marie's phone found on the table. She had forgotten it in a hurry, and now it was my only chance. I looked through the contacts, messages, and apps. Everything looked familiar, until I came across one chat called Clients. There were lists of names, phone numbers, and addresses in the chat. My heart sank as I realized the extent of what she was involved in. But the worst part was that the name Martin was on the contact list. It was mentioned more often than any other. I decided to find out who this Martin was. It wasn't hard to find him. The messages had an address where he often met with Marie and the others. It was an expensive restaurant in the city center. I went there that evening. The restaurant was exquisite, with huge glass windows and a shine that was immediately distasteful. In such places you meet people who are used to hiding behind smiles and false promises. I sat down at a table by the window and ordered coffee, watching the guests. And then I saw him. Martin was a tall man in an expensive suit. His movements were confident and his face was cold. He was sitting at a table with two other people, and their conversation seemed tense. From time to time Martin looked around as if he was looking for someone. I decided to act. I got up from my table and walked over to him. "Are you Martin?" I asked. His gaze slid over me, and for a moment there was something like surprise in his eyes. But he quickly pulled himself together. "Who's asking?" "The man whose wife you destroyed," I said firmly. Martin smiled. The smile was subtle, almost mocking. "You mean Marie? She's an interesting woman. But she made her choice." I clenched my fists, trying to contain my anger. Why? Why did you drag her into this?" "She came to me," he answered calmly. "I only give opportunities, and people choose whether to use them or not." His words sounded so easy, as if he were talking about business, not the destruction of other people's lives. "You will pay for this?" I said, feeling the adrenaline rush through me. Martin leaned in closer, his voice quieter. "I don't advise you to do something you don't understand. Some games always end in defeat, and it will be your defeat if you continue." I looked at him silently, trying to figure out how far I was willing to go. Martin stood up, nodded to his companions, and left, leaving me standing in the middle of the restaurant. This meeting was just the beginning. I knew I could no longer stand aside. If he thought I would give up, he was very wrong. My life was already ruined, and now I had only one goal left: to destroy everything he had built. The next morning I woke up with only one thought. I had to destroy Martin and his empire. But where to start? My resources are limited, and his network seems impregnable. I turned to Rick. He knew people in the police and among private detectives. If anyone could get information about Martin, it was him. "What do you want to know?" Rick asked when we met in his garage. "Everything. His finances, his connections, his weaknesses. I need a point where I can knock him out of the game." Rick sighed. "It will not be easy, but I'll try. Give me a few days." Those few days were unbearable. I felt powerless, but every hour only fueled my determination. Martin thought that his system was unbreakable, but I knew that even the strongest wall could fall if you found its weakest point. Rick called 3 days later. "I have something for you," he said. "We found his financial advisor. He works in a small office in the city center. If you can get him to talk, we'll have everything we need." I went to the office in question. It was a modest building that seemed too ordinary for such a dangerous business. I waited at the entrance until the man Rick had described came out. He looked younger than I expected and looked anxious as he looked around. "Excuse me, are you Jacob?" I asked him. He stopped and looked at me. "Who is asking?" "Someone who wants to stop Martin." His face turned pale. He nodded and gestured for me to follow him. We sat down in a small cafe nearby, and he began to speak. His voice trembled, but the words poured out like a stream. "You don't realize how dangerous he is. Martin is not just a businessman. He controls people through fear. His system works on bribery and intimidation. And how to destroy it?" I asked. Jacob pulled the flash drive out of his pocket. "Everything is here. His accounts, transfers, contact list. If this falls into the right hands, he won't be able to escape." "Why are you doing this?" I was surprised. "Because I'm tired of being afraid too," he replied. I spent the next few days passing on the information I had gathered to journalists and law enforcement. The news exploded with headlines about large-scale corruption and financial fraud. Martin became the face of the scandal, and his empire began to burst at the seams. But I knew he would not give up so easily. He would come after me. One evening I heard a knock at the door. I opened it and saw him. Martin was standing on the threshold, calm and cold as always. "You think you've won," he said. "But this is just the beginning." I looked at him without fear. "It's over. Your games are over." Martin smiled, but it was filled with rage. "We will see who wins this war." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway. I knew the fight was not over, but now I had what he feared most, the truth. I stayed on the doorstep for a few minutes after Martin left. His words haunted me. "This is just the beginning." He was not threatening, he was warning. I knew that the next attack would be powerful, but I also realized that I would not retreat again. The next day I woke up to a call. It was Rick. "Have you seen the news?" he asked. "What happened?" Martin started to act. "He is using his connections to twist everything. There are already stories in the press accusing you of being part of his scheme." I threw my phone on the bed and quickly opened my laptop. The headlines on the front pages were striking in their brazenness. Asterisk, "The main witness turned out to be an accomplice? Shocking details, star." Next to the text was my photo. Martin wasn't just trying to protect himself, he was trying to destroy me. Contrarian. I realized that I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I called Jacob, a financial advisor, who handed me a flash drive. "Jacob, have you seen what's going on?" "Yes," he answered. "Martin already knows that I gave you the information. I can't help you anymore. You have already helped enough. But if we don't stop him now, he will destroy me and you." He was silent for a few seconds. "I have another file," Jacob said. "It contains recordings of Martin's conversations with some of his associates. If these recordings fall into the right hands, they could bury him." Plan. Rick and I organized the transfer of the materials to the journalist who was working on Martin's case. It was risky, but we had no other choice. At the same time, I started recording a video message in which I told my story, explaining how I ended up in this chaos. I knew I had to act quickly before Martin ruined my reputation completely. Collision. A few days later, I received another call. The number was hidden. "You're playing with fire," Martin's voice said. "You think you can win?" "I've already won," I replied. "You know it's over." His laugh was cold and frightening. "You don't even realize what you've gotten yourself into yet. But soon you will." The connection was cut off. The next morning, the materials hit the press. Recordings of Martin's conversations with his partners caused a real storm. It turned out that his empire was built on blackmail, corruption, and money laundering. His closest partners began to turn their backs on him, saving their own skins. The police launched an investigation, and within a week Martin was under arrest. His empire had fallen, and I was finally relieved. But even after his arrest, I knew that the story was not over. Those who worked for him were still at large. I lost everything: my home, my family, my old life. But I found what I was missing: the truth. I knew that Martin's arrest did not mean the end of this story. The people who stood next to him could easily continue his work. But I was ready for new challenges. A few days after Martin's arrest, I received a letter. There were no words in it, just a photo. The photo was of my apartment, taken from the street. Someone was watching me. It was a warning. I called Rick and explained the situation to him. "They are still active," I said. "Martin is behind bars, but his people are not giving up." "It was expected," Rick replied. "Their system is too big to fall because of one man. But now they're afraid of you." This did not reassure me much. I began to notice the same cars parked on the street, the same people sitting in the same cafes. The fear returned. I met up with Jacob again, who was still holding his own, but was clearly nervous. "They know I helped you," he said. "I'm getting threatening calls. I need to disappear." "I can't do it for you," I answered. "But if you disappear, they will definitely realize that you are afraid. And fear will only give them strength." Jacob nodded, but I could tell he was scared to death. He disappeared in a few days without leaving a trace. The only thing left for me to do was to collect all the remaining materials that could finally destroy what was left of Martin's network. I approached the journalists again, this time more cautiously. My story was already known, but now I had to operate from the shadows. The next morning I heard the doorbell ring. There was an unfamiliar man in a black suit standing outside. "Can I come in?" he asked calmly. "Who are you?" "This is not important. I came to talk about what was going on. Martin was not in charge. You've only destroyed part of the system, but you'd better stop now." I let him in, even though my instincts screamed that I shouldn't. "Why are you here?" I asked. "To give you a chance. Stop. Leave it alone. You've already made enough noise, but if you go any further, it will end badly for you. And this is a threat." I answered, trying to remain calm. "No, it's an advice," he replied, standing up. He walked out, leaving me alone. My mind was in chaos. They knew I was still acting, but I realized one thing: if I stopped now, it would be a victory for them. The next few months became a game of survival. I worked anonymously, through contacts and networks that could not give me away. Every day was a new battle, but I knew I was doing the right thing. 6 months later, a major investigation came out. The journalists I gave the materials to published everything. Schemes, connections, names. It was the beginning of the end for those who remained in Martin's system. Now I live a quiet life. I left the city, changed my name, but the truth I uncovered became part of history. Sometimes I receive anonymous messages. Someone thanks me. Someone warns me. But I'm not afraid anymore. I left the city without looking back. All I had left was a small suitcase. On the way to my new life, I wondered if it was worth starting this fight at all. I think I won, but I lost everything that was important. Marie, my friends, my old life, all of it was now somewhere in the past. No one knew me in the small town I moved to. That was exactly what I needed. I rented a modest room on the outskirts and started looking for work. The days merged into one. I would wake up, work, come home, and go to bed. The silence was hard, but at the same time it gave me a sense of security. However, even here they found me. One evening, when I returned from work, there was an envelope on my desk, although I had definitely closed the door. Inside was only one sheet with an inscription: "We have not forgotten." I sat there for a long time, holding this sheet in my hands. The cold fear returned, but now I knew how to deal with it. I took that sheet, burned it in the sink, and decided that I would not give them a chance to ruin my life again. Instead of running away, I started preparing. I gathered all the remaining documents and handed them over to journalists who were already working on investigations. This time, I was not keeping anything for myself. I decided to act openly, albeit with great caution. Some of Martin's friends began to appear in the news. Their faces were no longer hidden behind masks. They tried to deny their crimes, but the evidence spoke for itself. Each of them felt that the ground beneath them was cracking. Their power was disappearing. But my struggle also had consequences. One day, 2 men found me at the entrance to the store. They didn't identify themselves. They just gave me a message. "This is your last warning. If you don't stop, we will find a way to end this forever." I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes after they disappeared, trying to collect my thoughts. I was scared, but the feeling that I was doing something important did not leave me. Everything I had gone through was not in vain. The final point was a major investigation that was published a few months later. The materials became available to everyone. I became an anonymous hero, even though I wasn't looking for it. My name was not mentioned, but I knew that without my actions this would not have happened. Now I live somewhere in the Midwest, in a small house overlooking the forest. I have no friends, but I have peace. Every morning, when I look at the sunrise, I remember what I went through and realize that it was worth it. The following weeks became something of a rehabilitation for me. I began to slowly return to life, but every day was a challenge. Even in the small town where I settled, I was haunted by the feeling that I could be found. I often look around on the streets, see familiar faces where they shouldn't be, and wake up at night from every unusual sound. One day, As I was sitting in a small cafe with a cup of coffee, a woman approached me. She looked ordinary, about 40 years old, with a short haircut and a stern expression. She sat down at my table uninvited. "You're the same guy, right?" she asked, looking me straight in the eye. I froze. For a moment I thought it was one of Martin's men. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, trying to remain calm. She smiled, but it was not a smile of joy. "You know, I saw what you did. People don't always talk about it, but you helped more than you know." I didn't know what to say. She stood up, leaving a small piece of paper on the table. "If you need help, please call. I don't know if it will make a difference, but there are people who are grateful to you, and they are ready to support you." After that, she left, leaving me in complete silence. I looked at the sheet. There was a phone number without a name. I did not call. I couldn't bring myself to involve anyone else in this. But this moment was a turning point for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I had done something meaningful. That even in the midst of this chaos, there are those who see the truth. A few days later, I received a letter. This time it was official, an invitation for an interview with a small local newspaper. The journalist wanted to discuss my role in the investigation. I hesitated. Going public was a risk, but it could also be an opportunity. I agreed. We met in a quiet park, where he asked me a few questions about my story. I spoke carefully, avoiding details that could give me away. In the end, he said, "You know that such things do not go unnoticed. You did what many were afraid to do." I nodded. On the one hand, these words were encouraging, but on the other hand, they reminded me that danger was still around. For the next few months, I tried to live a quiet life. Work, occasional walks, socializing with locals. All of this helped to distract me, but the feeling of tension did not disappear. I always carried my phone with me with a charged battery and tried to stay away from places where I could attract attention. One day I received a message from Rick. He wrote that some of Martin's people had started to lose influence. The police had taken their schemes seriously, and now many of them were either in jail or trying to escape. It was good news, but it did not bring me peace. I knew that there were still those who would do anything to take revenge. As I write this, I am sitting in my small house on the edge of the forest. Outside the window, I can hear the sounds of nature, and this is the only thing that helps me forget everything that happened. I don't know if it will ever come back, but I know one thing for sure. I did everything I could to expose the truth. And even if it cost me my peace of mind, it was worth it. All I have now is time and the opportunity to start over. Will I be able to do it? We'll see. But at least I will try. I was trying to start a new life, but the past kept coming back. Letters, calls, chance encounters with people who knew more than they should have. One day I went out on the porch of my house and noticed a car standing on the side of the road. It was not familiar, but a sense of danger hit me instantly. I didn't make any sudden movements, just stood there and looked at the car. The tinted windows made it impossible to see the driver. After a minute, the car started moving and slowly disappeared around a bend. At that moment I realized that they had not left me alone. The next day I decided to meet with Rick. He was always my main contact, and if anyone knew what was going on, it was him. "Are you sure you want to continue?" he asked as we sat in an old cafe in the city center. "This is not just a game anymore. If they feel threatened, they won't stop." "I know," I answered, trying not to show fear. "But I also know that if I back down now, everything I've done will be for nothing." Rick nodded, but I saw doubt in his eyes. He had been in this world longer than I had, and he understood the risks better. "I will find you some new contacts. Some of them may be able to help, but be careful. Even those who are on your side can be traitors." His words stuck in my head. I had already been betrayed once, and the thought of it happening again was haunting. But I knew there was no other way out. A few days later I received a new letter. It was short and handwritten. "Meet me at the old bridge at 10 p.m. It's important." There was no signature. I hesitated. Could be a trap, but it could also be a chance. In the end, I decided to take the risk. In the evening, I arrived at the designated place. The old bridge was dark and empty. Only the sound of the water below broke the silence. "You came," a voice said behind me. I turned around and saw a middle-aged man in simple clothes. His face was familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had seen him before. "Who are you?" "It doesn't matter. I'm here because I know you want to finish this case. I have information that can help. But it's dangerous." He handed me a flash drive. "Everything is here. Their new plans, contacts, financial transactions. If it falls into the right hands, you can completely destroy their network." "Why are you helping?" I asked, looking at him suspiciously. "Because they destroyed my life just like yours. We have different stories, but the same enemy." I took the flash drive and thanked him. The man disappeared into the darkness, and I was left alone on the bridge, feeling tension and fear mixed with hope. I spent the next few days going through the materials I received. It was much more than I had expected. Their network was huge. The names I saw made me cringe. Some of them were people I had once trusted. I contacted the journalists again, but this time I did it through an anonymous channel. Everything was published in a few weeks. The reaction was immediate. Scandals, arrests, dismissals, their empire was crumbling before our eyes. But at the same time, I knew that I had put myself in even greater danger. Now they will definitely not leave me alone. I am writing this sitting in my house, which now looks more like a fortress. Cameras, alarms, weapons at my fingertips. All of this has become part of my life. I do not know what will happen next, but I do not regret what I have done. The truth always matters, even if the price is too high. Will it ever end? Maybe it will. But as long as I am alive, I will fight. When you live in constant fear, even silence can seem like a threat. After the publication of the materials about Martin's network, I couldn't sleep properly for several days. Even a short creak of trees in the forest behind my house made me wake up in the middle of the night, grabbing my phone and listening to every sound. I started going to the city less often. Only the most necessary things, groceries, a few basic things. I didn't stay long in the store, always choosing a time when there were fewer people. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. One day, on my way home, I noticed tire tracks leading up to my driveway. I always parked my car in front of the house, and these tracks were quite fresh. They ended at the gravel area near the garage, but there were no other cars there. I looked around, no one. My heart started to pound. I closed the door and pulled out my phone, but there were no messages or calls. Someone was clearly making it clear that they knew where I was. The next morning I found an envelope on my doorstep. No signatures or stamps, just blank paper. It had only one sheet with an inscription. "You will not have time to escape next time." These words knocked the ground out from under me. It was not a warning, it was a direct threat. I called Rick. "They found me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you sure? Perhaps this is just an attempt to intimidate." "No, it's not easy. They know where I am, and they want me to realize it." Rick was silent for a moment and then said, "Listen, I think you should disappear for a while. There's a place where you can wait it out. I'll help you." I didn't like the idea. Running away again. I was tired of it. But Rick was right, it was dangerous to stay here. 2 days later, I left my home. I was helped to organize everything as discreetly as possible. A new phone, a car that was difficult to trace, and even some fake documents in case someone started asking questions. I moved to a small house on the outskirts of another state. This place seemed cut off from the world. A narrow road, almost no neighbors, only nature around. At first I thought it would be easier here, but every day I could feel the tension growing. Even without visible threats, I could not relax. Every noise, every unfamiliar sound seemed like a warning. One evening, when I was sitting on the porch, I heard a branch crack in the forest. I jumped up, looking around, but saw no one. A thought flashed through my mind. Maybe it's just an animal, but I could no longer calm down. I went inside the house, locked the door and sat in the dark clutching my phone. The next morning I decided that this could not go on. I called the same journalist who had previously published the stories. "I need more publicity," I said. It's the only way to make them back down. He agreed to help, but warned me that it might make the people who tried to stop me even angrier. I knew the risks, but I could no longer stand by. The more people know the truth, the less chance they will have to hide their crimes. A few weeks later, a new series of articles appeared. They mentioned new details of Martin's network, the names of his key associates who were still at large, and their influence in various industries. The reaction was immediate. New investigations, public statements, and even arrests began. My struggle was not over, but now I began to feel that I was not alone. People who were afraid to speak up started to get in touch. Some shared information, others just thanked me for starting this movement. But I also realized that every step I took brought closer the moment when they would try to strike the last blow. I was no longer afraid. If necessary, I will meet them, but I will not retreat. I don't know how it will all end, but I know one thing. The truth is the most powerful weapon, and I am ready to fight to the end. I knew that each new publication brought the decisive moment closer. The more I disclosed, the harder they pressed. They no longer hid behind threats, but acted openly. One evening, when I returned home, I saw the door open. My heart sank. When I went inside, I immediately realized that someone was there. Everything was upside down. Things were scattered. Cabinets were empty. They were looking for something, but I didn't keep any important materials at home. I quickly checked my laptop, but it was still there. It seemed like an attempt to intimidate me. I called Rick. "They were here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes, but this is already crossing the line. We need to act faster." Rick agreed. We decided to hand over the remaining materials to the federal authorities. It was a risky move, but we had no other choice. They had more resources and influence to complete what I had started. A few days later, I met with the agent who was handling the case. He looked reserved but serious. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. "Once this information gets into our hands, you will no longer be protected as before." "I understand," I replied, "but I'm ready." He nodded and accepted the flash drive with the documents. Leaving the meeting, I felt relieved, but also realized that there was no going back. The next few days were tense. I moved to a temporary place that Rick helped me find. It was a small apartment in an old building with minimal amenities. I spent my time monitoring the news and waiting for developments. The publicity started faster than I expected. Big media picked up the story. The main figures of Martin's network began to disappear from public space, but the police were already issuing arrest warrants for them. It was like dominoes falling. One by one, they were losing control. But at the same time, the risks have increased. I received several calls from hidden numbers. Voices warned me that I had made a big mistake and that I would have to pay for it. One morning, I woke up to a loud knock on the door. It was the police. "We have received information about a possible threat to your life," the officer said. "We want to offer you temporary protection." I agreed. I was transported to a safe house where I spent the next few weeks. I stayed in touch with the agents working on the case and followed the news. Eventually, the main culprits were detained, but that didn't mean it was over. I am writing this now, sitting in a new apartment that I was given after completing the witness protection program. My name has been changed. I cannot return to my old life, but I have no regrets. This fight cost me everything, but it was worth it. My story is over, but the consequences of what I did will be felt for a long time. Sometimes I think I hear familiar sounds or see faces from the past, but I have learned to live with it. The time I spent under protection made me realize one thing. I can't go back to the way things were. My actions not only changed the course of events, but also myself. I became a different person, more cautious, perhaps even cynical. But at the same time, I knew that the truth was worth the sacrifice. With Martin's entire network crumbling, I received one last call from Rick. His voice sounded calm, almost relieved. "You did it, my friend. They're not coming back. Their entire system is destroyed." "But what price did we pay for it?" I asked. "A price that was worth it," he replied. "Now it's their fear, not yours. His words were reassuring, but at the same time they reminded me that my life would never be the same again. After completing the protection program, I moved to another city. It was a small, quiet place where no one asked questions. I found a job in a local workshop, started going to a coffee shop that was a few blocks from my house. No one knew me there, and I started building my life from scratch again. One morning, as I was sitting over a cup of coffee, I saw a headline in the newspaper about the final sentences for those remaining in Martin's network. It was the end of that chapter, although I knew that deep down, the story would always be with me. I am writing these lines now, looking out the window at a foggy morning. My life has become quieter, but that's a good thing. I know that I have done everything I could to destroy the shadow network that was destroying the lives of many people. Sometimes it seems to me that it was a long time ago, as if in another life, but the memories come back. They will always be there, as will the reminder that the truth is the greatest power we have. Now I live for myself. I have no big plans or ambitions. Only calmness and confidence that even in the darkest moments you can find a way to the light. And this is the main thing. After it was over, I realized that peace of mind is the most valuable thing I have. The call I received that evening made me realize that the past would not leave me so easily. But I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. The next day I went to the police. I told them everything I knew and asked for help in ensuring my safety. They assured me that the case was still being investigated and offered me additional protection measures. I agreed to them. My life gradually began to gain new momentum. I began to socialize more with my neighbors, and I got a new job that allowed me to distract myself from heavy thoughts. George, my neighbor, became the one who helped me to believe in people again. We met often, talking about small things that seemed to be devoid of any threat or tension. A few months later, I received a letter. It was anonymous, but there were no threats. Just one sentence. Your courage has changed more lives than you can imagine. I held the letter in my hands and felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. The shadows of the past no longer darkened my life. They remained where they belonged in the past. I learned to live with what happened, and even more, I learned to appreciate every new day. This is not a story of struggle or loss, but of rebirth. Every step forward is a small victory. And now